In preparation for the message this morning, we're going to read from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, beginning the reading at verse 40 and continuing to verse 52. And the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. Every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the feast, according to the custom. After the feast was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. May the Lord bless his word.
There was once an elderly couple, and as they were growing old, the husband became convinced that his wife was losing her hearing. Well, she didn't think that was the case, and so this became a rather sensitive subject between them, and he said nothing about it for a while. But one day he decided an experiment. His wife was sitting in the lounge in their home in a comfortable chair. He was in the kitchen, and from the kitchen he said, "Would you like a cup of coffee, dear?" And there was no response, which is what he had expected. So he went into the passageway between the two rooms and he said a second time, "Would you like a cup of tea, dear? A cup of coffee, dear?" And again, there was no reply. He went and stood right behind her chair in the lounge so she couldn't see him. And he said, "Would you like a cup of coffee, dear?" And she said, for the third time, "Yes." Some of you need to think about that one, I think. We're all growing, we're all changing. That's the point I want to talk about. And growth is a constant thing in life. And whether you feel you're climbing a hill, or whether you're sitting on the top of the hill, or whether you feel you're going down the other side, you're changing. You're not the person today you were a year ago. You will not be the person next year you are today. Things change. Some of that growth we have no control over. Some of it is spontaneous. Some of it is deliberate. But what you are becoming, what I am becoming, is not simply an accident or a fluke. It is a result of what we are. You grow what you are. If you lay a foundation, it's slightly angled, and you put a building on it, the building will be angled. I've observed, as many of you have done, that some folks, as they grow older, they become more gentle and more godly and more kind. Other folks, as they grow, they seem to become more bitter, sometimes more angry. We have to recognize how we're growing. And I want to talk about growth this morning. I'm going to base it on verse 52 of Luke chapter 2, which talks about Jesus. And it says, Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. 4 ways in which Jesus grew. He grew intellectually in wisdom. He grew physically in stature. He grew spiritually in favor with God. He grew socially in favor with men. The 4 marks of balanced and important growth. And I want to look at this verse with you in the light of the passage that precedes it, which we had read to us, which is the only event recorded in the New Testament during the boyhood years of Jesus, or anything from his birth to the age of 30. Now, you'll be aware, of course, that the 4 Gospels that we have are not intended to be biographies. As biographies, they are completely inadequate. They don't tell us very much about Jesus. In actual fact, somebody has worked out that the 4 Gospels record events in only 30 days of Jesus' entire life. Now, we know that he ministered for 3 years. If that was 3 round years, that's 36 months. So from the period of his ministry alone, there are 35 months of activity about which we know nothing. We know that Jesus did a lot more than is recorded because John tells us at the end of his gospel, Jesus did many other things. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have enough room to contain the books that would need to be written. So John says, I'm just writing a little pamphlet, really. If I were to write the true record, the whole world, he says, wouldn't contain the books. And I'm grateful, as I'm sure you are, that at least the record we have of Jesus is reduced to some manageable size. Otherwise, it would probably sit like unopened encyclopedias on our shelves. Luke itself has only 37 pages. Luke is the longest gospel. I just began reading this weekend the biography of Winston Churchill, a recent biography. It's just come out, and that has over 1,000 pages. Churchill, where more than 50 biographies available of Churchill. So there's far more information about Winston Churchill than about Jesus Christ. We just have 4 little pamphlets that tell us about Jesus. And this is the only one, Luke's gospel, which contains this event that took place at the age of 12. When he was taken by his parents to Jerusalem from Nazareth, about a 100-kilometer journey. It took 3 days for them to walk it. And then on the return journey, which is where the drama takes place, after a day of traveling, they're settling down for the first night, and Mary and Joseph say, "Where's Jesus?" And nobody knows where he is. Who last saw him? Nobody last saw him. Was he around this afternoon? Nobody saw him. Was he here this morning? Did anybody see him when we left Jerusalem? Nobody saw him when they left Jerusalem. And so Mary and Joseph left the caravan of folks returning to Nazareth, went back to Jerusalem, and that was another day's journey, and then 2 more days of looking for him, because on the 3rd day they found him sitting in the temple with the priests and the teachers, asking them questions and listening to them. And of course they were upset. They were cross with him. They said to him, where is it? In verse 45, his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." And he replied, "Did you not know I had to be in my father's house?" Or as some translations put it, about my father's business. And that would have been a knife probably into the heart of Joseph. Joseph was not his biological father, but he's called his parent here. He was married to Mary, the mother of Jesus. And I've got a father, Joseph, who's more important in my life. I've got to be about his business. This marked a very important transition in the development of Jesus. Now, I want to talk about these 4 areas of growth that then verse 52 talks about. I'll change the order around a little bit. First of all, we talk about the fact he grew in stature. That is, he grew physically. Now, of course, we don't have much control over our physical growth. My son, Matthew, our youngest child, he's 11 now. I often say to him, "Stop growing. I want you to stay small." My little boy, you're going to be a man one day, and it's going to come too soon. You can't do anything about that. And once you stop growing that way, most of us start to grow that way. You can do something about that. Here's the good news. You really want to. But physical growth, let's talk about the physical growth of Jesus. You see, let's not forget that before Jesus Christ became a man, he became a boy who would have kicked a ball around the street, played with his friends up in the wood, gone hiding in the hills with them. I sometimes wonder what kind of boy he was, and you can be sure he was pretty normal, up to all kinds of fun and mischief. Because mischief is part of being a boy. Nothing wrong with that. Part of growing up, finding your boundaries. And he grew physically. Now, of course, one of the big questions that theologians have asked and are unable to answer is how Jesus grew in his self-realization, his understanding of who he was and what his destiny was. You see, we know that Jesus Christ was never, ever less than God. For in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. All things were created by him. Without him was not anything made that was made. He was never less than God. But the remarkable thing is, he lived as though he was never more than a man. He subjected himself to all the limitations of humanity. As I think I said a few weeks ago, even his miracles don't prove his deity, because Moses performed miracles. So did Joshua, so did Elijah, so did Elisha, so did Peter, so did Paul. Jesus' miracles were performed as a man. He says, my Father who lives in me, he does the work. And Jesus was confined to all the limitations of a human body. He knew what it was to get tired. He knew what it was to be weary. He knew what it was to be hungry, to be thirsty. He knew what it was to be tempted in all points, like we are. No exceptions to that. All points like you and I are. And before he ever became a man, he became a boy. Before he ever became a boy, he became a baby. Before he became a baby, he became a fetus in his mother's womb. Isn't that incredible? When he was born as a baby, he was born as a baby. He wasn't lying as a baby in his bed with the mind of God, knowing any moment now the wise men will be coming round the corner. Uh-oh, here they come. Pretend to be a baby. Did you bring the gold? Oh, yes, they have, yes. He was a real baby. That's why, as we'll see in a few moments, he had to learn obedience. God never learns obedience. God never learns anything. God knows everything. Jesus learned and grew. Now, this event here in chapter 2 of Luke is an event that took place when he was 12 years of age. Now, that may well have been the time that a Jewish boy became a man. I think it very likely was, although the age 13 has been more recognized amongst the Jews as the age of becoming a man. Today, when a Jewish boy celebrates his bar mitzvah, it's on his 13th birthday, and now he becomes a man. Now he is personally responsible for fulfilling all the commandments of the Jewish law. And this event at the age of 12 was clearly a very important one. We know things began to happen to Jesus at this point. We know he began to exercise his own will. He stayed in Jerusalem on his own volition. His parents weren't even informed. They were a bit upset by that. We know he began to exercise his mind in ways he possibly hadn't before. We don't know, of course, about before, but it tells us that he sat listening and asking questions and talking on his own with the leaders of the temple in Jerusalem. And this event at the age of 12 was very important. Anthropologists talk about rites of passage. What are rites of passage? They are events that children need to grow through, that are milestones on their journey to becoming an adult. Now, it seems to me that in our Western society, we have lost the value of this. We want everything now. That's the mentality. We sadly try to give our kids everything now. That's not wise. There's not much left to look forward to sometimes. We dress them in designer clothes. We allow them to put on lipstick and pierce their ears when they're still little kids. What are they going to grow up to? There's nothing left, so they've got to make up their own rites of passage. Smoking behind the bicycle shed at school, just to feel I'm a man, having sex with my girlfriend, because there's nothing left to show me I'm a man. In some of the more primitive cultures in the world, rites of passage have become a very important process in growing up. Bungee jumping, you familiar with bungee jumping? And people tie elastic around their ankles and leap off a platform or a bridge. I bungee jumped once in New Zealand off a bridge over a a ravine. It was the craziest thing I ever did, but the most exciting thing I ever did. This was before my heart attack. It's probably the reason why I had a heart attack. Well, bungee jump is a rite of passage for young men in the Solomon Islands, is where it comes from. They would tie a reed around their ankle, climb a high tree, leap off the tree, and they would land on a piece of, on a bank that was covered with water, and as they landed on the bank, they would slide down the bank. There's not much give in a reed, but if you can jump off the tree without fear, you become a man. Congratulations, boy, you become a man jumping off the tree. So I became a man late in life doing my bungee jump, but that's what it's from. When I was principal of Capering Bible School in England, we had a student about 3 years ago who was from the Maasai tribe in Kenya, in East Africa. He'd never worn a suit before he came to England, never used a knife and fork for going to the plane, didn't know what they were for. And he became a man in his culture by killing a lion with his bare hands. He had a great story about this. If I was preaching somewhere and they asked me to give a children's story as part of the address, I'd take him with me several times. He had this great story to tell about how he killed a lion. He went for 3 weeks out into the forest. And sometimes, of course, the boys who did that never came back. They were killed, sadly. But he had this stick, strong stick, and as the lion attacked him, he thrust this into the lion's mouth. The lion was going to grab him. He turned the stick, which wedged the lion's mouth open. The lion tried to clasp its jaw, and of course the stick, which was pointed out the side, penetrated through the back of his mouth into his head. At the same time, he took his knife and he stabbed the lion in the heart, and it fell down dead, and he came back a man. I'm glad I'm not a Maasai tribesman, because I think I would have been lion meat long before I killed the lion. Well, rites of passage are important. Now we leave it to the government to give us the rites of passage for our kids. They tell us when they can get their driver's license. That's an important stage. When they graduate from high school, when they can start to drink. I mean, not encouraging, I'm just saying that's the government gives the license, gives the law about that. But these are important milestones. And this was an important milestone in the life of Jesus, that his parents recognized. There's a day when you're 12, we'll take you to Jerusalem. And when we take you to Jerusalem, you'll be a man. You will sit like everybody else, and you will participate in the celebration of the Passover. While he was there, as I've said, he exercised his own will by staying on in Jerusalem, exercised his own plans and agenda about my father's business. His parents found that difficult. It says they did not understand what he was saying to them in verse 50. And sometimes, parents don't understand teenagers as they grow. The teenage road is a very choppy road. If you're a parent of teenagers, you'll know that. You know that better than if you're a teenager yourself. As a teenager, you're usually enjoying the ride. As a parent, you're standing on the side saying, wow, this thing's going to sink. But it's the best time of life. Fortunately, we enjoy teenagers. I've worked with teenagers a lot in my life, in my ministry, before coming here. And you see all the traumas, but it's an exciting time. Now they're discovering what it's like to be responsible and mature, and that discovery can be a difficult one. They need to know the boundaries. They need to know where the limits are. And when they can cross over them, the limits extend. And Jesus grew up in that environment. At the age of 12, taken to Jerusalem, an important stage in his physical growth, maturity growth. But the second area in which he grew was he grew intellectually, because it says he grew in wisdom. And when I say intellectually, of course, to grow in wisdom is a particular kind of intellectual growth. Wisdom is different to knowledge. We can accumulate knowledge very easily these days. We've never had such accessibility to knowledge. We can sit at home and press all kinds of buttons and on our computers, and we can access information. I carry an Encyclopedia Britannica on a CD disc with me. I've got one at home that's 36 volumes, but now I have one on a disc, and I can just press buttons, and it calls up all kinds of information. But I'll tell you this. You'll never gain wisdom by pressing buttons. There is information technology, there's not wisdom technology. What's the difference between wisdom and knowledge? Knowledge are cold facts that you can know in a detached way. Wisdom is always relational, because wisdom is not just knowing, it is doing. It's how we live. Jesus grew in wisdom. That needs understanding, of course. That's why we're told here in Jerusalem, in verse 46, it says that after 3 days they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. That's a mark of wisdom to start with. He was listening. He was asking questions. And wisdom comes not from propounding things, but by listening. Now, Jesus did speak as well, and he gave his perspective as well, because it says that everyone was amazed at his understanding and his answers. So presumably they asked him questions as well. But the operative statement about him was that he was listening and asking questions. That's how you grow wise. What was he asking questions about? Well, of course, I have no idea. But he was in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, so we may have a clue about that. He was amongst the religious leaders. You see, there were 3 festivals held every year to which every male Jew living in a 20-mile radius had to attend. If you lived further apart, as Nazareth was, you could attend just once a year. And these 3 festivals, the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles, were all significant because they were Old Testament symbols that were pointing to Christ. Now, people didn't fully understand that. They knew these had some significance about the future, what's coming. They hadn't associated the Christ, the Messiah, with sacrifice and death. That's why the Jews rejected him. But we know that the Passover was looking forward to the death of Christ. The Passover comes from the deliverance of Israel from Egypt, the night that God decreed that as the final plague, the firstborn son of every Egyptian family will die. Not only that, but the firstborn calf of every Egyptian cow will die in its stall. The firstborn lamb of every Egyptian sheep will die in the field. But for the Israelites, they took a lamb and they killed the lamb, put the blood on the doorpost of their home. They roasted the meat of the lamb and they ate the lamb with their coats on, belt around their waist, staff in hand, shoes on their feet, ready to run in the strength of the lamb. The moment the word came, you're free. And the angel of death that came to every Egyptian home, when it saw the blood on each Israelite home, passed over, which is why it became known as the Passover feast. And I imagine Jesus may have sat with these scribes and priests in the temple and said, you know, we had that Passover feast. And the 7 days of unleavened bread that followed, it was an 8-day celebration. Why does a lamb have to die? Why does blood have to be shed? I imagine him asking perhaps some of these questions. As maybe a realization was growing and dawning as the Spirit revealed little by little the nature of who Jesus was and what he was about to do. Because you remember that he was crucified at Passover. It was the Passover meal he was celebrating the night Judas betrayed him. The night he took the bread and wine, left from the Passover meal and said, this is my body, this is my blood. And by the next morning, 9 o'clock on the next morning, the first day of unleavened bread, he was on the cross, crucified. The other celebration was Pentecost. Pentecost isn't called Pentecost in the Old Testament. That's a Greek word. It means 50th day. It was 50 days after Passover. In the Old Testament, it's the first fruits, the celebration of the first fruits, the harvest. And during the intertestamental period, it became a celebration of the giving of the law. Whether that is historically accurate, I'm not sure. Nobody knows. And you remember on the day of Pentecost, celebrating the harvest, the giving of the law, which revealed God's requirements but left people powerless to fulfill them. On that day, the Holy Spirit came to fulfill God's requirements and bring in the harvest. Feast of Tabernacles was never never coincide with anything in the earthly life of Jesus, and many see that as a celebration of the return of Christ, because they used to come to Jerusalem and they more or less camped. They lived in booths made of palm branches for 7 days. It was great fun for the kids. Remembering we were in in the wilderness, on the way from Egypt to Israel, to Canaan. And in the wilderness, we lived in these difficult positions without the comforts of home. They lived in them for 7 days, and then they would fold them up. The time would come when that would end. And the time is going to come when God will fold up this world, and we'll go home. Foreshadowing the return of Christ. Yom Kippur. That's why some see this as a foreshadowing of the second coming of Christ. And Jesus may have said, ask questions about these events. We know Josephus, the historian of the time, tells us that during these major celebrations, up to 3 million people would congregate in Jerusalem. I'm not sure what the current population was. It was only a matter of thousands. 3 million would come. We know in Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, there were 15, was it, or so nationalities represented in Jerusalem from as far away as across the North African coastline and Italy and Rome and other places around that area, proselyte Jews who'd come back to Jerusalem to celebrate that event. And Jesus grew in wisdom by asking questions and listening to the answers. Never be afraid of asking questions. Never feel you have to know answers. Unfortunately, people sometimes think I know answers to things, so they ask me questions and they're surprised when I say I don't know. Well, you ought to. It's your job. And I say to them sometimes, why don't you go and find out? And when you find out, come and tell me what the answer is. Because we all need to learn to ask questions. And to listen and to learn. And Jesus grew in wisdom. Thirdly, he grew spiritually. He grew in favor with God. When Jesus was baptized at the age of 30, you remember that as he came out of the water, the heaven opened and the Spirit in the form of a dove descended, and God spoke from heaven and said, "This is my Son. With him I am well pleased." I am pleased. I am thrilled with him, said the Father. What pleases God? Do you know what pleases God? Because we ought to find out what pleases God. It's a verse which says, find out what pleases the Lord. We're told in the book of Romans about Jesus in chapter 15 and verse 3, even Christ did not please himself. His ambition was to please God. How did he grow in favor with God? Because there's a growth there. It's not simply that he pleased God, but he grew in the areas in which he might please God. Well, again, we're talking about silent years in Scripture, but there are some glimpses that we have. We're told in Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 8 that Jesus learned obedience from what he suffered. That is not talking about his years of ministry or the suffering we know about on the cross. This is long before then. In his growing years, he learned obedience from the things that he suffered. We don't know what that suffering entailed. We can speculate about some of it. One area we can speculate is the fact that this passage is the very last time Joseph is ever mentioned in the story. And therefore it is very likely that Joseph had died before Jesus began his public ministry. He was called the son of Joseph, the carpenter's son. But Joseph never figures anywhere. Mary does, of course, and so it's very likely that in his growing years he went through the awful, awful experience of his father dying, his human father dying while he was still young, maybe still in his teens. And all the anguish that brings into a young person's life, and all the sadness and the grief. We don't know how old Joseph was, probably not more than 20 years older than Jesus. They were just getting married. And that would be the age, late teens, maybe. And so maybe just 20 years older than Jesus. So as a young man, Joseph died. Whether he died through illness, we don't know. We have no idea. But we know that Jesus would have gone through the grief of that. And then as the oldest son became the breadwinner and taken on responsibilities that would have belonged to the father. But now we're past to the eldest son. He suffered. We know he was subject to all the traumas of everyday life. He wasn't given a fast track or an easy road through life. He had to learn obedience. Obedience has to be learned. The book of Proverbs tells us, folly is in the heart of a child, and the rod of discipline drives it from him. We are left instinctively to folly, not wisdom. To pleasing ourselves, not pleasing God. That's why those of us who are parents, we have to understand that. We've got to teach our children obedience. It's no good just saying, well, she just isn't obedient. You've got to teach obedience. And Jesus was not only obedient to his Father, but we're told in verse 51, then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. He was obedient to his mother and father in Nazareth, his parents in Nazareth. And so Jesus grew in favor with God. He grew spiritually in his obedience to God. And that obedience would extend and stretch. And as we are looking at the life of Jesus in Luke's gospel over these next weeks, we're going to see how that road of obedience took Jesus right from the beginning of his ministry into the wilderness to be subject to the attacks of Satan, alone for 40 days with no food in his stomach. You see, this didn't all begin with Jesus' public ministry. He didn't just while away the time as a carpenter saying, well, when I'm 30, then I'm going to begin to do certain things. I heard somebody say when I was 20, he said, when you're 20, you are what you're probably going to be for the rest of your life. The habits you've not cracked at 20, you'll have when you're 50 and 60 and 70. And I thought, don't be foolish. But I think he was right. You see, it depends. The kind of man you become, the kind of woman you become, depends on the kind of boy you were and the kind of girl you were. But it's never too late. It's hard work. But it's never too late to get back and say, Lord Jesus, the foundation is askew and the building is off-center and I'm growing in a sense of bitterness and chip on my shoulder. I want to get back. I want to love you, love others. I want to grow in wisdom, not just knowledge. And you see, this Jesus who became the friend of sinners must have been a boy who was a friend of sinners. We don't know about his boyhood. But I'm sure it was to his home the kids who were bullied in the street would go and find a real friend. The kids who didn't have the designer sandals, whatever they used to wear. Whose dad didn't have a camel. Could always play with Jesus. He grew in favor with God. That pleases God. He grew in favor with man. And that pleases man. He grew in wisdom. Didn't pontificate. He was wise. And he grew in stature. Every one of us in this building this morning is growing. None of us are static. We're becoming generally more of what we already are. But some of us need a course correction because the foundation has been tilted for a long while. I need to redirect, and what a time now as we go into another year to redirect and say, Lord Jesus, I want to grow in favor with God, in favor with men, in wisdom. And he'll get you back on track because that's his business.